Well, it's great to see so many people here already. I'm Rachel Gordon, and I teach in the Department of Religion and the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida, where I'm also the Bud Shorstein Fellow in American Jewish Culture. And this event is being sponsored by the Samuel Bud Shorstein Endowment. Bringing that up reminds me that since I see a lot of undergraduates in our audience, so I just want to remind people, I'm going to share screen for a moment. Hopefully we're looking at our writing awards. We've got 3 big writing awards, 2 that are $1,000 and 1 that is $500 for you to submit by May, and you don't have to be a Jewish studies minor or major or in a Jewish studies class. Just be working on something with Jewish content, and we'd love to see your work submitted for these prizes. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Naomi Seidman, who is the Chancellor Jackman Professor in the Arts at the University of Toronto. She is the author of several books, including Faithful Renderings, Jewish Christian Difference and the Politics of Translation, and The Marriage Plot, or How Jews Fell in Love and with Literature. And very recently, A Revolution in the Name of Tradition, Sarah Schenirer and Bais Yaakov. I had the pleasure of getting to know Professor Seidman a bit when I was a postdoctorate fellow at the University of Toronto. So I am really sad that we don't have her in person, but I feel like we will have another chance to bring you to Gainesville, and that will really be our pleasure. So I'm delighted that we get to hear about recent research from you today. And want to remind folks, you can put your comments and questions in the Q&A at any point, and we'll be able to weave them into our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I would, now that I'm realizing how much I love Gainesville and how many friends I have there, you and just so many other people. I've had such good times there. People I went to graduate school with, people whose work I admire. Now Natalia Alexström, I think, is coming, or maybe it's already there. So I'm really sorry to be missing, I don't know, hanging out in the warm sun and drinking coffee with Robert Kawashima or whatever it would be. But this is also very sweet. So, and thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see so many people. And I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. The way this is going to work is I'm going to take about a half an hour to just lay out the basic story of, you know, what happened with these 93 Bais Yaakov girls. I'll explain what Bais Yaakov was. And then I think we'll just have a conversation. Rachel and I will have a conversation about what it all means. I'm going to resist trying to interpret it as I tell the story. And then this is very much work in progress, very much material I have no real beat on yet, but I'm trying to figure out. So I'm really looking forward to a lively conversation about what this story means. So let me just share my PowerPoint and start telling you what that story is. Hopefully you can see that. Let me just explain this a little bit. And, you know, thank you also to the Shorstein Foundation and to the endowment, I think it was called, and to Rachel for inviting me, and to all my friends at in the University of Florida. So here's the story. January 8th, 1943, the New York Times has a quite shocking story on page 8 about 93 Orthodox Jewish girls from a school system called Bais Yaakov, who choose to commit suicide just as they're about to be taken as prostitutes for the German army. The story got a few details off. So the actual place in which this story is supposed to have taken place is not Warsaw, but Krakow, which was the site of the teacher seminary, of the main teacher seminary of this school, Orthodox girls school movement. And what the New York Times story describes as a letter arriving in New York purporting to explain what happened from the girls themselves, from one of the girls, Chaya Feldman, what happened on that day. So you can, I know it's a little distracting to have one text up and to read another text. So maybe stop looking at that text and let me read the story, the letter in its complete form so that you get all the details. So this is the letter dated August 11th, 1942, that arrived in New York to someone named Mr. Schenkelevsky, who was the chairman of the International Organization of Bais Yaakov, which in America was, Bais Yaakov did not hardly existed in New York at that time. Now it certainly does. But at that time, Bais Yaakov was in America, was largely a fundraising arm of the movement. So this is what the letter says. I do not know whether this letter will reach you. Do you know who I am? We met at the house of Mrs. Schenirer and later in Marienbad. Mrs. Schenirer is the divorced seamstress who founded the system. There's the image of her that circulated in the interwar period on the right of your screen. When this letter reaches you, I will no longer be among the living. Together with me are 92 girls from Bais Yaakov. In a few hours, all will be over. Regards to Mr. Rosenheim and to our friend Gutmann, both in England. Rosenheim, the executive director of Jacob Rosenheim of Agudas Yisrael, the world organization of Orthodox Jewry that Bais Yaakov operated under the auspices of. We had 4 rooms. On July 27th, we were arrested and thrown into a dark room. We had only water. We learned David, the Psalms, by heart and took courage. We are girls between 14 and 22 years of age. The young ones are frightened. I am learning our mother Sarah's Torah with them. It is good to live for God, but it is also good to die for him. Yesterday and the day before, we were given warm water to wash, and we were told that German soldiers would visit us this evening. Yesterday, we all swore to die. Today, we were taken out to a large apartment with 4 well-lit rooms and beautiful beds. The Germans don't know that this bath is our purification bath before death. Today, everything was taken from us, and we were given nightgowns. We all have poison. When the soldiers come, we will take it. Today, we are together and are learning the confession all day long. We are not afraid. Thank you, my good friend, for everything. We have one request. Say Kaddish for us, your 93 children. Soon we will be with our mother, Sarah. Yours, Chaya Feldman from Krakow. So this particular letter made a huge impression. But before I talk about the impression it made, let me just explain what Bais Yaakov is and was very quickly for those of you who don't know. And Bais Yaakov continues today with in about 1,300 schools at least, where the Bais Yaakov project, which this is part of, is attempting to map that. But let's look at the interwar period for a minute at a different map. I love old maps. And this particular map was produced in 1931 by the group of men that you see there on the left. So this is a map of what the system looked like in 1931, in the summer of 1931, when they toured the system. 200 and something schools in the world, 187 schools in Poland, and also summer camps. Bais Yaakov was a youth movement under the auspices of the Agudas Yisrael, the Orthodox political organization. By 1931, it already existed in Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Romania. By 1934, it was also in the land of Israel and Germany, in Western Europe, in Antwerp, and in New York by 1937. These men are the fundraisers in Central Europe. Bais Yaakov was funded, the heart of it was in Poland, but it had various Bais Yaakov offices, not only in New York, but also in London and in Central Europe, where the more, the wealthier Orthodox Jews supported their poorer counterparts in Poland. So there's the men in their group, and there are the maps, and there's much more to say. I could have given a whole talk about Bais Yaakov, but let's just say that that's what we have right now. And oh yes, well, one more thing, which is the crown jewel of the system, this seminary where the suicides are supposed to have been taken place. I believe that's the largest circle in, actually that's the large circle on the bottom of your map, the bottom left of the map. But there were also teacher seminaries in Czechoslovakia. There was one in Vienna, and there was one in Romania and Chernovitz, now Ukraine, where my mother actually went to school. So the impression that was made by the 93 was huge. Rabbis in every denomination devoted their sermons on the following Sabbath to talking about these 93, the request that they be remembered by people saying Kaddish, by Mr. Shenkolevsky saying Kaddish, was fulfilled by many people for many, many years to come, including one woman that said Kaddish for the 93 for 50 years, for the rest of her life. In the land of Israel, where I'm going to be focusing my attention just for, to narrow my topic a little bit, the 93 were commemorated with street signs in 5 different towns. So this one is called the Street of the 93. I think that's in, I forget where that is, Rishon LeZion or Zifron Yaakov, or one of those places. There are street signs in Tel Aviv. In Bnei Barak, there's the Park of the 93, which you can still go to and see. There's a 1,000-tree grove in Palestine to honor, quote unquote, Poland's girl martyrs, and paid for by the Junior Hadassah group in Brooklyn. So you can see this is a kind of international effort. These are 2 booklets that I bought on eBay for really expensive for booklets, but really cheap for juicy research, that commemorate 2 different, that were published around 2 different commemoration ceremonies for the 93. The one on the left is the one that was the commemoration ceremony that was put on in 1943. So just a couple of months after the New York Times article came out, there was already a huge commemoration with the fancy pamphlet or booklet. I think it's around 35 pages. So it's not a cheap thing. And this particular commemoration ceremony happened on the anniversary of Sarah Schenirer 1935 death. So not the first anniversary of August 11th, when this was supposed to have happened, but the anniversary of, I believe it was March 3rd that year, of Sarah Schenirer 1935 death. The one on the right was from a commemoration ceremony in 1947. And I'll talk a little bit, I'll focus on these 2 particular books and see what this story meant in 1943 and 1947. So what you see here is that the letter of the 93 became a kind of sacred text that was translated into various languages. Here you see Hebrew. It was also translated into English. It became the core of a kind of liturgy of Holocaust commemoration throughout the Jewish world in 1943, and more narrowly in 1947 within the world of ultra-Orthodox Jews, and particularly ultra-Orthodox Jewish girls and women, at which this letter is recited at ceremonies. It constitutes a major source for Holocaust memory, and maybe you could even say sex education in Orthodox girls' schools. The 1943 commemoration was led by a group of men headed by Rabbi David Prato, who was the chief rabbi of Rome, first Alexandria and then Rome, who was a refugee in Jerusalem during those years. He died in a plane crash, in 1951. And his partner in this enterprise, his collaborator, was the right-wing Zionist, but pretty secular literary critic and historian, Joseph Klausner. So I think one of the things this tells us is that in 1943, this story far transcended the narrow world of Agudas Yisrael or Bais Yaakov or Agudas Yisrael, and was basically the product of a committee of people who were either non-ultra-Orthodox rabbis or involved in Zionist culture, a kind of strange coalition. And one of the things I'll tell you about this is that the committee that organized the mass commemoration in 1943 was called the Committee for the Defense of the Honor of the Jewish Daughter. Clue number one, let's say, about what this meant. A committee that was a committee that functioned under the auspices of the Tel Aviv Jaffa municipality, not even Jerusalem, the heart of the ultra-Orthodox community. This is the Bilu Auditorium where the first commemoration was held, extremely emotional. At this particular commemoration, which spanned the spectrum in participants and speakers, there was actually only one speaker affiliated with Bais Yaakov, a Bais Yaakov teacher, and who called upon the women who had attended the event to light one candle beyond their usual Shabbat candles, and to take on the extra candle for a year, take on lighting an extra candle for a year. 1947, the commemoration booklet looks quite different. It's nowhere near as expensive, for one thing. It ends with let's just say in 1943, I actually have that. In 1943, sorry about that. Here are my copies of in 1943, the booklet ends by calling on all Jewish women to remember the sacrifice of these girls and to live their lives modestly and with gratitude for not being in Eastern Europe, but in Palestine, in the land of Israel, where they are safe from Nazi rapists. And what they do in honor of these 93 is comport themselves with the dignity that a Jewish woman, a daughter of Israel, should comport themselves. And one of the things that I've discovered about the existence of this committee that put together the 93 memorial in 1943, only 2 months after the story first broke, is that they were formed not in response to this news, but in response to two other scandals, which were one scandal involved a story in the daily press in the land of Israel about young Zionist pioneer girls in Tel Aviv who were dating British police officers. So, in other words, consorting with the colonial enemy, and instead of rebuilding the Jewish people on the Holy Land, just going after whoever they wanted to have sex with. And the message is pretty clear that in one part of the world, girls are killing themselves rather than have forced sex with the German. And here in the land of Israel, where Jewish life is supposed to be reborn, Jewish girls are voluntarily dating non-Jewish men. The other scandal, which was even worse in the eyes of many people, was that it turned out that Tel Aviv, which was going through an economic crisis, had a bustling sex worker scene, and that prostitutes, Jewish prostitutes in Tel Aviv, who were the majority, were taking Arab customers as well as British colonial customers. And this is what sparked the formation of this committee in 1942, and explains why the last page of the pamphlets that they produced is directed to the young religious and or secular Jewish woman, asking her to maintain her purity. And it also explains why a secular right-wing Zionist and let's say moderate Italian rabbi would come together around this issue. By 1947, for a range of reasons, the commemoration of the 93 was a purely Bais Yaakov affair. And the last page of the booklet is actually an advertisement for the Tel Aviv school, the main Tel Aviv school, which you can see is a fairly modest building. I mean, we have other pictures of it on 2 Gruzhinsky Street, so it's not the fancy Bilu auditorium. It's now retreated from the public scene. And why has it retreated from the public scene? And pretty much from here on in, it becomes almost solely a Bais Yaakov story, except for periodically, I met giving a talk about Bais Yaakov, not about on this subject. I met a woman who was a choreographer in LA who had put together a dance about the 93 in Los Angeles in the 90s. So people still somehow stumble upon this story. Sometimes it's in Holocaust liturgy, and it still survives to some extent outside of Bais Yaakov, but now it's really part of the world of Bais Yaakov. It's part of Bais Yaakov commemorative culture, and it reinforces Bais Yaakov culture in many ways. And just to explain how and why this happened, the fame of the 93 gave way fairly quickly to the fame of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters. And in the land of Israel, the commemoration efforts and the pride that could be felt around fighting men versus suiciding women seems to have overcome the interest of this in this story, and the story receded from public memory. It also seems very clear that the story was becoming, it was more and more clear that the story was a pious fiction. And it never actually happened. And we're now outside of Bais Yaakov, and even in some quarters inside of Bais Yaakov, historians more or less dismiss this story as a kind of, in some way, even offensive, prettified packaging for the horrors of the Holocaust. So instead of being ripped away from your family and degraded, these girls, it's true that they're about to become prostitutes, but they're given beautiful beds and they're alone together, and they recreate some of the powerful moments of their interwar lives. They're reunited with Mother Sarah, as she's known in the movement. It's a kind of fantasy about the Holocaust that in some ways makes it beautiful and palatable, even as it's also about sex, death, kitsch. You could sort of see the attractions, right? It's an old package, right? This sex, death, kitsch, and piety. It appeals through the sex, but the sex is covered with the piety, etc. So this is the kind of recipe for its appeal. But why it is that we no longer believe it happened is that no one ever showed up, with one exception that I'll talk about in a minute, to say, we've heard of Chaya Feldman. Yes, our aunt was in the Krakow seminary and we know she disappeared at a certain moment. There's no evidence other than this letter for the events that allegedly transpired. And whether it could have transpired is a historical debate that I won't get into. There's at least some people who say, yes, it could have, despite the laws against racial mingling, there were such houses of prostitution. In any case, it seems not to have transpired, even if it could have. And another piece of evidence that this story is starting to be doubted is that the 1947 booklet that I'm describing now, that ends with this advertisement for the Tel Aviv school to parents, to Orthodox parents, obviously, that page says from Krakow to Tel Aviv. So Tel Aviv taking on the figure of Krakow. And in fact, when they built a building in 1964, a much bigger, larger central Tel Aviv Bais Yaakov building, the facade was in the form of the facade of the Krakow seminary, which I realize I should have provided a photo for you, but I will if anyone's interested. So the 1947 booklet includes an eyewitness letter from someone named Hannah Weiss in Bogota, Colombia, talks about how she somehow witnessed this whole episode from a window in the alleyway of the building. And not only does she describe this episode as having happened, but she produces a whole, the only way I can think of describing it is as a play about the girls and the teacher and the principal. And I hope you notice that in the letter, there's no mention of anyone being a teacher or a student. They're just girls of different ages, whereas she produces a principal. And all of this is supposed to bolster a claim that probably is being already doubted. But in fact, it has the opposite effect. Not only is she able to hear, reams of dialogue. One particularly moving scene is one of the girls says to the teacher, "I don't understand. What is it that the soldiers want to do to us?" And the teacher says, "Oh, you innocent child, you don't even know about sex," right? So it's an incredibly dramatic and overblown play. And the reason I'm calling it a play is that, in fact, in Bais Yaakov, the 93 are a staple of the theatrical repertoire. And theater is hugely important for, if there are any Bais Yaakov girls out there, I know you know this, that the Bais Yaakov play is a big thing. People rehearse for months, if not years, for a production. We call it a production in North America. And Sarah Schenirer herself was a playwright. We have, and these are plays for girls and women only. And we have a poster of a play in 1926. So this goes way back. And it really does seem as if a play is being written on this subject, as if in anticipation of the uses of this story in Bais Yaakov. One little detail, Sarah Schenirer died in 1935. Yehuda Leib Orleans, a man, became the director of the Krakow seminary. He was already in Warsaw and escaped a terrible beating from Krakow to Warsaw in 1942. There's no principal. In other words, there's no figure that this could be, this particular female principal. No one's ever heard of anyone else who's led Bais Yaakov after Sarah Schenirer and Yehuda Leib Orleans. So this eyewitness letter, and also the names Chaya Feldman and Hannah Weiss, are kind of the Jane Doe of the Orthodox world. So there's no reason to believe this eyewitness testimony any more than there is to believe the original letter. So let me just say a few more things about this. That this is from the 1947 booklet, and then maybe we could go to the question. And in the 1947 booklet, what becomes stronger and more evident than in 1943, when Bais Yaakov is barely mentioned, when Sarah Schneirer's name does not appear, is that Sarah Schenirer, although the memorial event happens on her yahrzeit, that Sarah Schenirer comes to take a huge role in memorial culture for Bais Yaakov, and for ultra-Orthodox Jews in general, the male world as well as the female world, that the figure of Sarah Schenirer, despite the fact that she died in 1935, is somehow tied to the culture of what Bais Yaakov was during the worst moment of its life in all kinds of ways. Just to give you a couple of examples, the women who survived, including this group of 10 that survived together in Auschwitz, many of them came to the land of Israel. They were considered kind of, those who had met Sarah Schenirer were considered kind of royalty. And they often had stories about how it was the spirit of Sarah Schenirer. If you remember in the letter, the girls will be reunited in heaven with our mother Sarah. One of the women who survived in Auschwitz says that she once took 5 extra minutes to be with Sarah Schenirer, as Sarah Schenirer was to walk her to the train station after she visited the seminary. She was going off somewhere. She said that 5 extra minutes kept me alive for the 5 years of the war. There are other sort of miracle stories about Sarah Schenire's spirit, keeping girls alive in some way. And the memory of Bais Yaakov is really filtered today through the memory of Sarah Schenirer. Yehuda Leib Orlean, the last director, his name is barely ever mentioned. The major fundraiser in Vienna, Deutschlander, is also not mentioned. The Holocaust memory of Bais Yaakov and Sarah Schenirer as the mother, who somehow brings together, if you see on the right, it says the mother and her daughters. These are her, quote unquote, her daughters. Sarah Schenirer, as those of you who went to Bais Yaakov know, Sarah Schenirer never had children, but every Bais Yaakov girl, past, present, and future, is Sarah Schenirir's daughter, which makes all the Bais Yaakov girls in the world sisters, and which, to explain how I see it, but not just me, other people who work on ultra-Orthodox Holocaust memory, Sarah Schenirer becomes a way of covering over a chasm that was not only the chasm of, the murder of 6 million, but also the powerful threat to the to Orthodox faith, the question of how people manage to survive. All these questions get bridged for a generation that's orphaned. So most of the young girls who moved to Palestine after the war to rebuild Bais Yaakov, along the lines of Bais Yaakov in Poland, were orphans, and they were also orphaned of their mother. And this gave an entire orphaned, let's say, religiously traumatized generation, a mother whose piety and spirit could help them rebuild Bais Yaakov as it's now been rebuilt. Let me just move ahead to what it is today. I'll go back to that other slide after I stop share. So Bais Yaakov, as I said, exists in 13 countries with over 1,300 schools all over North America. Plenty in, I don't know, Gainesville, I doubt has one, but Miami certainly has more than one. And these schools are no longer connected with any kind of central office. They're connected in basically one way, which is a shared origin story. A shared origin story that allows them to function, to reproduce their cultural values of modesty and piety and rebuilding the Jewish home through a symbolic mother, Sarah Schenirer. And there what you see, in which the Holocaust, despite the fact that it's not part of the Sarah Schenirer story, nevertheless is wrapped up in all kinds of ways with the memory of Sarah Schenirer. So what you see in the top left of your screen is, this is Barclays Center in Brooklyn, where something like, this is Sarah Schenirir's 80th yahrzeit gathering. So the 80th was in 2015, and many, I think around 30,000 people commemorating Sarah Schenirer, people, women and girls. People know that men, ultra-Orthodox men, congregate in the numbers. There are always pictures of vast seas of black. Well, here's seas of girls in long skirts, girls and women listening to speeches, singing songs, all dedicated to the memory of Sarah Schenirer. There's a group of, oh, there's the facade. So I did provide it. So there's the facade of the Krakow Seminary on the river in Krakow. And there's a group of Bais Yaakov Girls going between Jerusalem and New York. They're everywhere. They take a stop at the seminary building. And there's a plaque to Sarah Schenirer. And there on the right is Sarah Schenire's grave being erected in 2005. The grave was destroyed in the Holocaust as part of the destruction of that entire cemetery. And there on the right, you can see a group of girls in the snow. There are girls dancing and singing around Sarah Schenire's grave many times a week throughout the year. There's a group right now who are in Warsaw, who are commemorating Sarah Schenire's yahrzeit. And there, I'll just say, Sarah Imenu, this is a graphic novel in Poland, in Polish, that was just published about a week ago. I'm interviewing the writers and the illustrators in 2 days, so I'll know a lot more about it. But in Bais Yaakov, in Poland, the memory of Sarah Schenirer is kept alive not only by the very small Jewish community, small Orthodox Jewish community, who have produced a certain kind of very low budget museum, also catering hall in the old seminary building, but also by Polish feminists, many of them not Jewish, who remember Sarah Schenirer as one of the most important Polish women of the 20th century. So I'm going to stop my share and we'll head into the conversation. Sorry if I've gone too long. Thank you so much for listening to all that, and I hope I got everything, all the necessary information in there.
Thank you.
Ask some questions. What is this story and what does it mean?
Right, Professor Seidman, as you mentioned, this is happening in the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi world, but when that New York Times article, and that's from 1940, what year was that again, 1942?
No, the Times article was January 8th, 1943.
1943. So I'm curious, is the non-Orthodox world reacting to this? Or do you find, because it's that ultra-Orthodox world often seems really separate from the rest of the Jewish world, and especially the American Jewish world. They seem exotic and different and other. So I'm curious how sort of mainstream American Jews, how are they reacting to this story?
They were reacting with extreme enthusiasm, interest, and horror. And it was, as I said, Bais Yaakov barely existed in North America at that time. There was a small school in Williamsburg that had very little official support. Mm-hmm. It was basically, Bais Yaakov was basically a fundraising committee on the Upper West Side, run out of the Jewish Center. So even the people raising money for Bais Yaakov were not ultra-Orthodox. The head of the Bais Yaakov committee was the honorary chair of the Bais Yaakov committee, not the man who the letter was sent to, was Eleanor Roosevelt. Bais Yaakov was considered first of all, a Jewish story, and also it was Jewish girls. They didn't necessarily know what Bais Yaakov was, but it was Jewish girls. And it was a story that they could somehow that spoke to everyone. There were gatherings all over the United States, and there were poems and, as I said, sermons and money. People didn't know where to donate money, right? That's what Americans were. That's where they went. And they were trying to figure out where to donate money. So you get this donate money to somehow the land of Israel. Well, there's nothing we can do. Yeah. So yes, it was a completely just a Jewish story, at least in the, in 1943, it was a Jewish story. It was only in 1947 that it was a Bais Yaakov story.
Okay, and as Lawrence Edwards points out in the comments, Bais Yaakov was a pioneering effort in education for girls. From what you're saying, it sounds like people didn't know all that in 1943. They couldn't place it as, oh, this is actually really important for the sake of educating girls in Judaism, etc.
They had a very, for instance, the fact that they didn't know that the center of Bais Yaakov was in Krakow, not in Warsaw. For them, the whole Jewish world is Warsaw in Poland, right? So for many, many people, the details were very vague, and they just associated it. Okay, they knew Orthodox girls, that's what they knew. Some of them knew more. Bais Yaakov did have a very well-established international fundraising project, which, I think is part of the story too. Why would Eleanor Roosevelt be on the International Committee?
Right. Part of the story, as you mentioned, or a big part is sex. I don't know how much in 1943 American Orthodox Jews were talking about the sex in the story. And, to us, that sounds weird to think that Orthodox Jews were grappling with that or even discussing it. We don't think of it as maybe part of the Orthodox conversation. So how did they deal with the sexual part of the story in the 40s?
Thank you for asking that. That really gets at one of the ways. I mean, various people have written about this and they have different ways of understanding it. I've already described this idea I got from Michal Shaul that Sarah Schenirer functioned as a kind of healing mechanism for an orphan system, but it doesn't really explain like who wrote this letter and why did it go to New York? And I think I have a little beat on that. So actually, if you don't mind, let me share my last screen, which I, sorry, the one before let me just find the slide beforehand. So this is something that this is a kind of feature of Bais Yaakov memory, Bais Yaakov history that I just stumbled on by chance, that I really couldn't understand, but I think it's related to this story, which is that Bais Yaakov got most of its funding, or I don't know if most, I don't know exactly how to calculate it, but some significant share of its funding through its connections with the international organizations that were fighting against what was then called the International White Slave Trade, which was basically prostitution rings that were heavily populated by Eastern European pimps and prostitutes, sex workers, and I don't know, are we supposed to use a PC term for pimps? So Jews, Eastern European Jews, and particularly Polish Jews, were very heavily represented in this business all over the world. I think Buenos Aires is famous for this, but a lot of the people in the brothels in Buenos Aires came from Poland, but also in New York, etc. And the Jewish world, in concert with suffragist movements and feminists like Eleanor Roosevelt, you can see the letterhead on the left where she writes the Bais Yaakov was the most poignant and most, oops, sorry, I can't quite read that because my screen sharing thing is there, but hopefully you could read the quote from Eleanor Roosevelt on the Bais Yaakov letterhead. This is the London office. So basically, Bais Yaakov piggybacked on the huge amounts of money that were being raised to stop prostitution or to fight back against prostitution in Poland. And in Poland, prostitution in Bais Yaakov was never mentioned that I have found, not a single mention. Sarah Schenirer did not talk about it. On the other hand, whenever Bais Yaakov administrators or fundraisers went west, so to this conference in London for the Jewish Association for the Protection of Girls and Women, which is code for anti-white slave trade, they always packaged Bais Yaakov as the antidote to girls becoming prostitutes. There were other antidotes, right? Bertha Pappenheim set up these sort of welcoming desks in a you know, where you'd show up in a railroad station, which is where the pimps would try to meet single girls traveling on their own in, you know, Vienna or Berlin or New York or Buenos Aires. And instead of being met by, you know, a young man who, you know, gave them a compliment on their dress, they were met by women working for German feminist organizations like the one run by Pappenheim. So in London and in New York, Bais Yaakov raised money through the trope of prostitution. I actually think this is goes a long way to explaining who might have written this particular letter and how. In the absence of any direct, I don't think it's the entire story, but I think it explains why it is. It's really, I mean, what you're pointing out is just how shocking it is that the Orthodox world is talking about sexual violence. Most feminist Holocaust historians say that talk of sexual violence didn't happen immediately, certainly not during the war, but often for decades after the war. There was too much shame. That's the way it's understood. So it is really remarkable that not just this conversation about forced prostitution, even using the word shame. If you remember the newspaper article, it says these girls are you know, kill themselves rather than be subjected to this shame of being taken as prostitutes. And I think shame, I think affect theory also has a lot to offer. Why this was written, and to, you know, the feeling of shame, the shame of sexual violence, but also the shame of not being able to protect your women in a patriarchal culture, the shame of what these girls could bring to the Jewish community, but didn't. It's almost like a prophylactic against that shame.
So some of our surprise at seeing this conversation about sex is, I guess, also answered by the fact that this story is about Orthodox women who would rather die than have that happen, which sort of makes the conversation more okay. In the comments,
Definitely.
Susan Shapiro writes, there was a story about Hannah Senich that was told in the American Orthodox world, at least in the yeshiva of my girlhood, that claimed that she pinned her skirt to her legs so that when she was dragged through the streets by the Nazis, after she was caught by them, she would be able to maintain her modesty. Was there a genre of stories about heroic Jewish women that framed these narratives in terms of Jewish women's heroic modesty, or was this story influenced by that of the story of the 93?
Oh my God. Oh my God. I have to get, is that my friend Susan Shapiro?
Maybe we'll hear back from her.
I don't know if we can hear from people, but I didn't know that about Hannah Senich. Of course, it's part of the parrot story, the three gifts. It's an old Jewish story. To the trope of pinning your skirt to your legs to keep it from flying up as you're being tortured. That actually appears. I mean, it's not just it's a trope, and it goes. You know, the stories of I think the Crusades or it's such an old story, and it just strikes me as being so right. So the girl in some way penetrates herself to maintain her virginity, and that it's not just about maintaining your virginity, it's about maintaining a long skirt. And of course, anyone who's gone to Bais Yaakov knows there's an obsession with how long your skirt is. But one of the most shocking twists on this particular trope is that I found a newspaper, my Polish research assistant found a newspaper story from 1932, I think, of a Bais Yaakov girl who committed suicide by jumping out of the top floor of that seminary building. And she was discovered, and Bais Yaakov was trying to say that she had somehow fallen and that it wasn't a suicide, and there was some question of whether she had somehow tried to tie her skirt to herself in some way. I don't think there was a pin involved, but the question of whether it was a suicide or a fall hinged on whether if she was committing suicide, even if she's a desperate Bais Yaakov girl or a depressed or, you know, in any case, a suicidal Bais Yaakov girl, still that, you know, modesty must be maintained. And it must be maintained, you know, not only externally by the school checking skirt lengths, which is a big activity in Bais Yaakov, but also it must be internalized. And all these stories are ways of internalizing the importance of modesty, of course. So
Yeah.
I have to talk to Susan about the Hannah Senesh story. I wasn't aware of that. And I'm still working on this material, obviously.
It was, I don't know, about or 10 or 15 minutes into your presentation, I think you revealed that this, in fact, we do not think this happened. This story, you know, did not actually take place, that the suicide occurred. And so that leads to the question of why, you know, who and why did they create this story? And I guess I wonder, was it on the American side of somebody wanting to say those ultra-Orthodox that you think of as totally alien are actually, you know, they can be colleagues in the struggle to end prostitution. They're more, you know, maybe in alliance with our American Christian values than we think. I mean, for what purposes? This has the feeling of maybe being sort of propaganda for some agenda.
I think it's part, I mean, I think I already kind of answered this question. And to me, this is, you know, there were two questions for many years around this story. And one question was, did it happen and could it have happened? And the second one was, who wrote it? If it didn't happen, then who wrote it and why? And I think the answer of who wrote it and why, my suspicion is that it's part of a genre of fundraising stories in which Bais Yaakov acts as a you know, a bulwark against prostitution. But I think it's clearly done by an insider who knows something about Bais Yaakov culture, someone who spent time there, understands how Sarah Schenirer is felt. And it may also reflect, what I was trying to say is, may also reflect the psychology, a kind of male shame around female potential shame, if that makes sense. But I also think that given that the story continues, that it's had so many afterlives, you know, these girls, quote unquote, kill themselves, and yet they're alive, right? That's one of the tropes that you always hear. It's in the memorial booklets. These girls kill themselves and their memory will live forever. I don't know about forever. Who knows how much longer we'll have a livable planet, but it's certainly alive and well, this memory. So I think that question of not only what it meant at the outset, but what it continues to mean, and the work that it continues to do, and the fact that it continues to do such local work, the fact that 4 years apart with very similar, you know, memorial booklets that you think you're looking at the same thing and it's totally different. That this story is just too necessary to too many different people for too many different reasons for it to ever go away, despite the fact that it's now widely known that it is almost certainly a fiction.
Thank you. Nisan Herskovitz writes, would you please comment on the significance of the August 11th, 1942 date and the possibly elegiac nature of the letter, which I think someone else commented. Yes.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, wow, there's someone else I know, all people I know here. So I'm trying to remember, I think I looked up what day that was in the Hebrew calendar. It sounds like it's right around Tisha B'Av. Does this guy know exactly what the date is?
Maybe Nisan will let us know what else was on that date. Yeah. You think
so
that might
it's
have
right
been
around Tisha B'Av. So it would be very interesting to know if it was during the 9 days or after. And the reason why and I believe I once investigated this, but can't remember now what I came up with. But if it's, you know, if it's during the 9 days, well, that's totally appropriate, right? It's the And we can also ask what was going on in the Kraków Ghetto at that time. Is there a reason for this particular date? What was happening? Were there, was there any Bais Yaakov activity? We know there were underground Bais Yaakov cells. I think other people have done that kind of historical work. But the question of what it means on the Bais Yaakov calendar is very interesting. And for those people who are really insiders, so if they had spent any time in August at one of those summer programs in the mountains in the south of Poland, the Tatra Mountains, then they would know that Tisha B'Av, and also if you spend any time in an Orthodox summer camp, you'd know that that period right around Tisha B'Av into Tu B'Av, Tu B'Av was a huge Bais Yaakov holiday. And Tu B'Av was a kind of festival of female solidarity, if you want to call it that. It took a basically matchmaking festival and turned it into a homosocial, all-girls love fest, maypole, midsummer thing. So if it was playing around with those two poles of Bais Yaakov culture, then this letter was written by somebody who was really an insider, if not by Chaya Feldman herself.
Right, and in the comments, Lauren Edwards write that Tisha B'Av in 1942 was July 23rd. In 1943, it was August 10th.
That's interesting. So, if they had been commemorating this on Tisha B'Av as opposed to on Sarah Schenire's yahrzeit, that would have made sense as a kind of add-on to Tisha B'Av, which is in some ways the Israeli Holocaust, the Orthodox Holocaust Memorial Day. But as a matter of fact, it was after, but maybe July 23rd. They talk about July 27th as the day that they were taken into that. Okay, this is an excellent line of questions that I'm sorry I don't immediately have. There are these people who can just automatically calculate whether August 23rd was a Tuesday in 1972. That's the kind of stuff I need to do this work. So, and you're reminding me that I need it. So thank you for that.
You mentioned that Sarah Schenirer, who I guess died in 1935, but the commemoration of the 93, she becomes very wrapped up in that. From your presentation, I felt like the reason for that is just, she's considered the mother of sort of all the girls who are part of the Bais Yaakov school system. It makes some sense to me that she'd end up being, she'd get sort of enfolded into this story, but why else do you think that's happening?
I think that there's a kind of necessary reduction from 93 to 1, right? We don't know who Chaya Feldman was. We don't know if she was a teacher. It would be sort of odd to lift up this kind of, maybe it's already becoming obvious that she's a fiction. So Sarah Schenirer having to do work, including the work of behave yourself if there's a Holocaust, which how could she have known, which is a big part of the lesson that's learned. I think what the being wrapped up with Sarah Schenirer also helps us do is it helps us put a face to the kind of a female face to an organization which is really organized, administered, led, controlled by a bunch of men. And the female face of a historical figure who deserves to have that female face does an enormous amount of work. In other words, I don't think that Bais Yaakov could have had the success it did to appeal to girls and women if it didn't have some compensation for what's required, all the strict rules and the modesty. And some of that compensation is given to girls by having a symbolic female face to a movement that's really, in some very basic way, patriarchal. So it's a kind of female face to patriarchy. And this is also, let's point out that we're talking about a patriarchal system, right? We're talking about, the violent rape by soldiers, and then also the men who have no control over these girls. They're far away, they're on another continent. There's nothing they can do. And yet these girls somehow have to continue to do what they've been taught to do in the absence of any men. Just like the girls have to continue to be good when their teachers and fathers and brothers are not watching. There's some sense in which the figure of Sarah Schenirer helps with this internalization process.
Well, I'm just looking at one other question we have. One attendee asked, why do you believe this topic is important and what are its implications for today? I guess that feels maybe especially important to people as they realize, well, wait, this didn't happen anyway. So that question we academics always have to answer, which was, why should the rest of us care?
Right, why should the rest of us care? Yeah. I mean, I have to admit that I don't, I'm not making any huge claims for the significance of this, but I would just say that we all have stereotypes about the Orthodox world, and my guess is that your stereotypes involve a black hat and big gatherings of men. And the fact that there is a female culture that, at least at certain moments, actually wins out over the male culture, right? So in 1943, it was the girls who were the most interesting Orthodox Jews for the whole world. And that it's, I think, significant that the whole world got interested in these girls at a certain moment when they thought that they were, these beautiful martyrs. And that I think that there's something important about recognizing the existence of a somewhat independent girls' culture in the Orthodox world that isn't just a counterpart of the male culture, that has its own particular dynamic, and that it has an intricate history that I think complicates, and all the Orthodox girls that you read about or see Netflix shows about them leaving, they went to Bais Yaakov, many of them, at least Deborah Feldman did or whatever. This is where they come from. And the fact that this doesn't appear, that this is no longer known, I think is part of the way in which we reduce ultra-Orthodoxy to a kind of cliche or a caricature of itself. And it's my hope that I've given you a little glimpse into the complications of Orthodox culture and ways in which other types of connections might be found, not only Orthodox versus secular, but that at a certain moment, Eleanor Roosevelt had great sympathy for the cause of Bais Yaakov, that other kinds of alliances are possible, that non-Jewish feminists in Poland are figuring out ways to remember Sarah Schenirer as part of Polish history. So this is also part of American Jewish history, as well as of American history, even American presidential history, or at least American First Lady history. So this is a much, I think, a different story than what you may have expected, at least I'm hoping it is. And I'm hoping that it opens, it opens up vistas in the, the particularities and the specificities, not just of Orthodox culture, but of all cultures that we stereotype.
Well, thank you so much. This was really fascinating, and you can tell from the comments that many people are very intrigued to learn more. Thank you, Professor Seidman, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. And go to my website if you want to know more.